Renee Hartfield knocked on the door twice, and on the second knock, the door moved. It was not locked. It drifted open under her knuckles, just an inch, just enough to show a slice of the dark hallway inside. Renee stood on the porch with her hand still raised, and for a moment she did not move at all. Carol Whitcomb never left her door unlocked. Not once in the 11 years Renee had known her. Carol checked the lock twice before bed, and once more before she even sat down to watch the evening news. Renee pushed the door open the rest of the way, and stepped inside. The smell hit her first. Not a bad smell, just a closed one. The smell of a house that had not had its windows opened in days. The hallway light was off, but the lamp in the living room was on, even though it was 2 in the afternoon, and sunlight was already pouring through the curtains. On the side table sat a teacup, half full, with a thin gray skin floating across the top of the liquid. Renee looked at that cup for longer than she meant to. She could not explain why, but it was easier to look at the cup than to think about what else might be wrong in this house. 3 days of mail sat crammed in the box outside. She had passed it on her way in, and barely registered it until now. In the flower bed near the porch, a pair of garden shears lay open in the dirt, abandoned mid-cut, as if Carol had simply stopped trimming the roses and never picked the shears back up. Renee's phone was still warm in her pocket from the call that had sent her here. Jordan, her closest friend since college, 3 states away on a work trip, had texted her that morning, sounding more rattled than she had heard him in years. His mother had not answered her phone in 4 days. 4 days was nothing unusual for Carol, who forgot her phone on the kitchen counter more often than she carried it. But 4 days combined with missed calls and an unanswered landline had been enough to worry Jordan into asking Renee for a favor. "Just check on her," he had written. "Just make sure she's okay. I'll owe you forever." Renee had said it was nothing, that Carol probably just lost the charger again. She had said it lightly, the way you say things to keep a friend from spiraling on a business trip he could not leave. Now, standing in the dim living room with the cold teacup in front of her, that lightness felt like something she had borrowed and could not give back. "Carol?" Renee called out. Her voice sounded too loud in the quiet house. No answer came from the kitchen or the hallway. Renee moved through the living room, past framed photographs of Jordan at every age, past the armchair where Carol always sat with her crossword puzzles, the pencil resting on an unfinished grid on the side table. The pencil had rolled halfway off the table, like it had been set down mid-thought and never picked back up. She found Carol in the back bedroom, sitting upright on the edge of the bed, fully dressed, her hands folded neatly in her lap. For 1 full second, relief moved through Renee's chest like warm water. Carol was alive. Carol was sitting there, awake, looking almost peaceful, looking like a woman waiting for a bus that was running a little late. "Carol, thank goodness," Renee said, crossing the room quickly. "Jordan's been trying to reach you. We were worried." Carol turned her head toward Renee slowly, and her eyes took a moment to focus, the way eyes do when someone has been staring at one spot on the wall for a very long time. Then she smiled, the same warm smile Renee had always known, the one she gave at Thanksgiving dinners, and at Jordan's graduation, and at every small kindness anyone ever offered her. "You look just like your mother," Carol said. Renee paused. "Carol, it's me. It's Renee." "Of course it is," Carol said, though something in her voice did not sound certain at all. Renee sat down on the bed beside her, taking Carol's hand the way she would take the hand of anyone who seemed unsteady. Carol's skin was cool and dry, and her grip, when it closed around Renee's fingers, was stronger than Renee expected. Much stronger. Carol pulled her closer, fast enough that Renee's shoulder bumped against hers, and brought her mouth close to Renee's ear. "Don't let him back in," Carol whispered. The words landed somewhere low in Renee's stomach, a place that had nothing to do with thinking and everything to do with instinct. She pulled back just enough to look at Carol's face, searching for an explanation in her expression. But Carol had already let go of her hand and folded her own hands back into her lap, calm again, distant again, as though the whisper had come from someone else entirely. "Who?" Renee asked. "Carol, who do you mean?" Carol blinked at her, slow and unbothered. "Is it cold in here? I think it's gotten cold in here." It was not cold. The heat was running, the vents humming faintly somewhere in the walls. Renee felt the difference between the 2 women sitting on that bed, the one who had gripped her wrist with real urgency, and the one who was now asking about the temperature like nothing at all had happened. She had read enough, in passing, in the way people read things without meaning to study them, To know that sudden confusion in an older adult could mean 100 different things, most of them medical, most of them treatable, most of them nothing at all like what her gut was telling her right now. But her gut was telling her something, and it was telling her loudly. "I'm going to make you some tea," Renee said, standing, needing a reason to move, needing a task small enough to hold on to while the larger thing sat unexamined behind it. "And then I think we should call your doctor, just to be safe." "That's nice of you, dear," Carol said, and smiled again, the porch light kind of smile, warm but with nothing behind it that Renee could read. Renee walked back down the hallway toward the kitchen, and it was only as she passed the coat hooks by the front door that she noticed it. A jacket, dark green, heavy canvas, the kind of jacket built for someone broad in the shoulders. It was not Jordan's. Jordan was tall and narrow, and besides, Jordan's jackets all still hung in his old bedroom closet, untouched since he had moved out years ago. This jacket was new, or at least newly there, hanging on the third hook, as if it belonged exactly where it was. Renee stood and stared at it the same way she had stared at the cold teacup, letting the smallness of the object hold the weight of everything she did not yet understand. A jacket meant a person meant a visitor, or worse, someone who came and went enough to leave a coat behind without thinking twice about it. From the back bedroom, Carol's voice rose, light and conversational, asking Renee if she remembered to bring her books back to the library before they closed for the holiday. There was no holiday. There was no library trip that Renee knew of, but there was an urgency creeping into Carol's tone now, a thread of something under the friendliness, and Renee found herself walking quickly back down the hallway, the jacket and the question of who it belonged to pushed, for now, into the back of her mind, waiting for the moment she would have time to ask. She did not know yet that she would not get that moment for a long while. She did not know that the whisper she had just heard would turn out to be the only honest thing said in that house all afternoon, and that everything Carol told her after it, every warm smile and every gentle, confused question, would need to be picked apart later, piece by piece, to find the truth buried somewhere underneath. For now, she only knew one thing for certain. Someone else had been in this house. Someone with broad shoulders and a habit of leaving his jacket behind, like he expected to come back and wear it again soon. And whoever he was, Carol was afraid of him. Renee made the tea anyway, because her hands needed something to do, and because some old instinct told her that ordinary tasks kept ordinary fear from turning into the kind that made people freeze. She filled the kettle, found the same chipped mugs Carol had used for years, and set 2 of them on the counter, before catching herself and putting one back. There was no reason for 2 mugs. Jordan was not here. She was not staying for company. And yet her hand had reached for a second mug without her telling it to, like some part of her had already noticed the rhythm of a house built for 2 people now instead of 1, and was simply following the pattern it had absorbed without permission. She carried 1 cup of tea back to the bedroom. Carol took it with both hands, thanked her sweetly, and asked if Renee would mind closing the blinds, because the afternoon sun, she said, had gotten too sharp lately. Renee crossed to the window and closed the blinds, and as she did, she glanced down at the driveway below. It was empty, no car but her own. But the gravel near the side of the garage had 2 sets of tire tracks pressed into it, overlapping, one set older and faded, one set fresh enough that the small stones were still pushed up at the edges in clean ridges. Carol did not drive anymore. She had given that up 2 years ago, after a fender bender in the grocery store parking lot had scared her into handing her keys over to Jordan for good. Someone else had been parking in that driveway. Recently, more than once. Renee let the blind fall shut and turned back toward Carol, who was sipping her tea with the placid, untroubled expression of a woman enjoying a quiet afternoon at home. The contrast between that expression and the words she had whispered 10 minutes earlier sat in the room like 2 different people occupying the same chair, taking turns. "Carol," Renee said carefully, sitting back down beside her, "earlier, when you grabbed my hand, you said something to me. Do you remember?" Carol's eyes drifted toward the window, toward the closed blinds, and for a moment, her face did something Renee had never seen it do before. It did not crumble exactly. It folded, the way paper folds along a crease that has been pressed into it too many times to ever lie flat again. "I don't know what you mean, dear," Carol said. But her hand, the one not holding the teacup, had curled itself into the bedspread, gripping the fabric the way a person grips something to keep from being pulled away from it. Renee watched that hand and understood, in the quiet, frightening way that understanding sometimes arrives without any words attached to it at all, that Carol remembered exactly what she had said. She remembered every word of it. She was simply too afraid to say it again. Renee stayed another 20 minutes, long enough to watch Carol finish her tea, long enough to make sure the stove was off and the back door was locked, and the confusion that had clouded Carol's earlier moment seemed, for now, to have passed. She told herself she would call Jordan as soon as she got to her car. She told herself she would mention the jacket, the tire tracks, the whisper, all of it, and let him decide what it meant. But as she stood to leave, Carol caught her wrist one more time, gently this time, no urgency in the grip at all, and looked up at her with an expression that was somehow both completely lucid and utterly pleading. "Come back soon," Carol said. "Please, before he does." Renee promised that she would. She did not yet know how soon would have to be. Renee sat in her car outside the house for a long moment before she turned the key. The street was ordinary in every direction, sprinklers ticking on someone's lawn, a kid riding a bike in slow circles at the end of the cul-de-sac. The kind of afternoon that made everything she had just felt inside that house seem almost embarrassing in its intensity. She dialed Jordan anyway. He picked up on the second ring, his voice tight with the particular worry of someone far away from a problem he could not fix with his own two hands. "Is she okay? Renee? Is she okay?" "She's okay," Renee said, and heard herself soften the truth even as she said it, the way people do when they are still deciding how much weight another person can carry from a distance. "She's a little confused. She called me by your mom's sister's name. I think it might be worth getting her in to see her doctor, just to rule things out." "Confused how?" Jordan asked. "Like forgetting things, or like, I don't know, like something's actually wrong?" Renee looked back at the house through the windshield. The blinds in the back bedroom were still closed, the way she had left them. A curtain in the front window twitched, just slightly, and was still again before she could be sure she had seen it at all. "I think she just needs a checkup," Renee said. "I'll go back tomorrow and see how she's doing. Don't worry yet, I've got this." It was the kind of thing you said to a friend 3 states away who could not get on a plane fast enough to fix anything tonight. And Jordan, exhausted and grateful, let himself believe it, because believing it was easier than the alternative. They talked for a few more minutes about flights he might be able to move up, about whether his mother's regular doctor took walk-ins, about nothing that touched the actual shape of what Renee had felt sitting on that bed, with Carol's hand locked around her wrist. She did not mention the whisper. She told herself it was because she did not want to alarm him over what might turn out to be nothing. She knew, somewhere underneath that explanation, that the real reason was simpler and less flattering. She did not yet know what the whisper meant, and she was not ready to hand Jordan a fear she could not explain. She drove home, made dinner she barely tasted, and went back the next morning before she had even finished her coffee. This time, a woman was standing in the yard next door, pulling weeds from a flower bed, with the brisk efficiency of someone who had pulled the same weeds in the same spot for 30 years. She straightened up when Renee's car pulled into Carol's driveway, peeling off a gardening glove, and waving with the kind of friendliness reserved for people you have decided, on sight, are not a threat. "You're Jordan's friend," the woman said, before Renee had even closed her. "Renee, isn't it? Carol talks about you." "That's me," Renee said, crossing the low hedge that separated the 2 yards. "I don't think we've met properly. I'm sorry, I don't know your name." "Grace Dunmore. I've lived next door to Carol for longer than I care to admit." Grace glanced toward Carol's house, and something in her friendly expression dimmed, just slightly, like a lamp on a slow dimmer switch. "I saw you come by yesterday. I almost came over myself, but I wasn't sure it was my place." "Your place for what?" Grace hesitated, the way people hesitate when they are about to say something that might sound foolish out loud, something that has only made sense so far inside their own head. "There's a man who's been coming around, older than you, younger than me, somewhere in the middle, I suppose. Drives a gray sedan, nothing fancy. He's been here, 3 or 4 times a week these last couple of months. Always lets himself in like he owns the place." Renee felt the same low drop in her stomach that the whisper had caused the day before. "Do you know who he is? A relative, maybe?" "That's the strange part," Grace said, pulling her glove back on absently, more out of habit than need. "I asked Carol about him once, just being neighborly, you understand, and she got very quiet, said he was an old friend of her late husband's, helping her with some paperwork. But Renee, I've lived next to this woman for 30 years. I went to her husband's funeral. I never once heard that man's name in all that time, and suddenly he's here 3 times a week, telling me not to bother Carol too much because she tires easily. Grace's mouth tightened. I don't like being told not to check on my own neighbor, especially not by a man I've never been introduced to. What's his name? Renee asked. Elliot, Grace said. Elliot something. I never caught the last part. Carol's never said it twice the same way, if I'm honest, and I've started to wonder if that's on purpose. Renee thanked her, promised to keep her updated, and walked up to Carol's front door with the name sitting in her chest like a stone she had swallowed without meaning to. Elliot. Not Jordan's name. Not any name Renee had ever heard attached to Carol's small, quiet, predictable life. A life that had, until 4 days ago, consisted of crossword puzzles and rose bushes and Sunday calls from her son. Carol answered the door this time, fully dressed, hair combed, looking for all the world like a woman who had simply slept poorly and was otherwise entirely herself. She greeted Renee warmly, ushered her into the kitchen, and put the kettle on before Renee had even finished taking off her shoes. For nearly an hour, the visit felt almost normal. Carol talked about her roses, about a recipe she wanted to try, about a book club she had quietly stopped attending months ago for reasons she waved off as nothing important. There was no confusion in her voice. There was no grip on Renee's wrist, no whispered warning. It would have been easy, sitting there with a cup of tea going cold between her hands, to decide that yesterday had been a strange and isolated moment, the kind that happens to anyone once in a while, and that today was the truth of things. But Renee had not forgotten the jacket on the hook, or the tire tracks in the gravel, or the way Carol's hand had curled into the bedspread like something trying to hold on to the floor of a boat in rough water. When Carol excused herself to use the bathroom, Renee did not waste the time. She moved quickly through the living room, scanning surfaces she had not had the chance to examine the day before. On the bookshelf, tucked behind a row of paperback mysteries Carol had collected over decades, Renee's eye caught on a slim folder, plain manila, slightly out of place among the spines of novels. She pulled it free and opened it standing up, listening with half her attention for the sound of the bathroom door. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a financial document from Carol's bank, dense with the kind of language Renee had to read twice to understand. A request for a transfer authorization, a significant sum, far more than Renee would have guessed Carol kept in any single account. The form was not filled out completely. A line near the bottom, marked for a secondary signatory, sat blank, waiting for a name that had not yet been written in. Tucked behind that page was another document entirely, this one a draft power of attorney form, the kind that grants someone legal authority to make decisions on another person's behalf when they no longer can. Carol's name was printed neatly at the top, beneath the line reserved for the person being granted that authority. In handwriting that was not Carol's careful, looping cursive, someone had written a name in plain block letters. Elliot Marsh. The form was unsigned. Whatever this man wanted, he did not have it yet. But the fact that the paperwork existed at all, sitting half-finished behind a row of mystery novels in a house where Carol triple-checked her locks and panicked over an unlatched door, told Renee everything she needed to know about how close he had already gotten. She heard the bathroom door open down the hall and slid the folder back into place behind the books, her heart beating in a way that felt entirely out of proportion to the small, quiet act of putting a piece of paper back where she had found it. When Carol came back into the room, smiling, asking if Renee wanted more tea, Renee smiled back and said, "Yes, please," and sat with her hands folded in her lap, holding the secret of what she had just read like something too hot to put down and too important to drop. She left an hour later with a promise to return soon, the same promise she had made the day before, except this time it carried weight she had not had words for until now. In the car, she sat with her phone in her hand for a long time before she dialed anyone, scrolling instead through the search bar, typing in the name Elliot Marsh with fingers that did not feel entirely steady. No social media profile that matched, no obvious record tying him to Carol, or to Jordan's late father, or to anything Renee could pin down. The name floated there on her screen, plain and unremarkable, attached to nothing she could use, and somehow that emptiness frightened her more than if she had found something terrible written under it. A man who left no trace was a man who had taken care to leave none. She thought about calling Jordan right then, telling him everything, the whisper and the jacket and Grace's warning, and the unsigned form with a stranger's name written where a son's name should have been. She thought about how that conversation would sound, how thin and half-formed it would seem, a power of attorney that had not been signed, a man no one in the family had heard of, a moment of confusion that might, after all, turn out to be nothing more than a small and forgivable stumble of an aging mind. She did not call him, not yet. She told herself she needed more before she handed him a fear this large to carry alone from 3 states away. She told herself she would go back one more time, ask a few careful questions, see if she could learn anything that would either calm the dread sitting in her chest or confirm it beyond any doubt. What she did not tell herself, because she did not yet know it was true, was that the next time she went back to that house, she would not be looking for confirmation anymore. She would be looking for a way to get Carol out of it. Before she left the house that second day, Renee made one more pass through the living room, this time with her eyes open in a different way, the way a person looks at a familiar room once they understand that something inside it does not belong. She noticed the cushions on the armchair sat slightly askew, one propped higher than the other, the kind of small disorder Carol would never have tolerated in the years Renee had known her. Carol straightened cushions out of habit, the same way she locked doors out of habit, the same way she folded napkins into careful triangles before anyone sat down to eat. Renee lifted the high cushion without quite deciding to. A phone sat wedged into the gap beneath it, screen dark, the case scuffed along one corner in a way that suggested it had been dropped more than once. It was not Carol's phone. Carol's phone, an older model with a cracked home button Jordan kept promising to replace, sat charging on the kitchen counter where it always did. This one was newer, sleeker, the kind of phone someone carried for work rather than for calling their grandchildren. Renee pressed the side button. Nothing happened. The battery had died, whoever it belonged to, and there was no charger in sight that would fit it. She turned it over in her hands, studying the back, the corners, anything that might tell her something, and found nothing but a smudge of fingerprints across the dark glass and a small scratch near the camera lens, shaped almost like a check mark. She thought, briefly and seriously, about taking it with her, about slipping it into her bag and figuring out later how to charge it, what might be waiting on the screen once it woke up. Her hand actually closed around it, the weight of the decision sitting heavier than the phone itself. Then she heard the engine. A car was turning into the driveway, gravel crunching under tires in a rhythm Renee recognized now from the tracks she had seen the day before, the fresh ones pressed into the stones beside the older, fainter set. She had no way of knowing if it was Elliot. She had no way of knowing if it was a delivery driver lost on the wrong street, but every instinct in her body told her not to be standing in this living room holding someone else's phone when whoever was driving that car walked through the front door. She shoved the phone back into the gap beneath the cushion, straightened it the way Carol would have, and was halfway to the kitchen by the time she heard the car door close outside. Her pulse was loud in her own ears, loud enough that she barely heard Carol's voice drifting in from the hallway, asking if everything was all right, dear. You look a little pale. I'm fine, Renee said, and meant it as little as she had ever meant anything in her life. I should get going, actually. I'll come by again soon. She left through the kitchen door at the side of the house, the one that opened onto the narrow strip of yard between Carol's place and Grace's, and walked the long way around to her car parked at the curb, taking the route that kept the hedge between herself and whoever was now walking up the front path. She did not look back until she was buckled into the driver's seat with the engine running, and when she did look, she caught only a glimpse, a broad set of shoulders disappearing through Carol's front door, a dark green jacket slung over one arm. She drove 3 blocks before she had to pull over, her hands shaking too hard on the wheel to trust herself at the next intersection. Sitting there at the curb, engine idling, Renee thought about the unsigned power of attorney form tucked behind the mystery novels, about the name written across it in plain block letters, about the phone with the dead battery hidden under a cushion in a house where nothing was ever out of place by accident. She thought about Grace's careful, worried voice describing a man who told her not to bother Carol too much, and about Carol's own hand gripping her wrist hard enough to leave a faint pink mark that had not fully faded until that morning. None of it, taken piece by piece, would have been enough to convince a stranger that something was wrong. A confused moment, an unfamiliar name, a misplaced phone, a neighbor's hunch, each one small enough to explain away on its own, the way a single loose thread does not yet look like a sweater coming apart. But Renee was not looking at the threads one at a time anymore. She was looking at the whole sweater, and what she saw was a man who had made himself comfortable in Carol's house, who had begun the paperwork to take control of her finances, who had told a neighbor of 30 years to keep her distance, and who had arrived, again, on a day Renee happened to be standing in the living room going through his things. That last part frightened her more than anything else, not because it meant he had seen her. She was fairly sure he had not. It frightened her because of what it told her about how often he came, how comfortable he had become moving through that house, how little anyone in Carol's life, aside from a worried neighbor and a son 3 states away, had any idea this was happening at all. She drove home with the radio off, the silence in the car doing nothing to quiet the noise in her head, and that night, lying awake long after she should have fallen asleep, she made a decision she had been circling for 2 days without quite landing on it. Tomorrow she would find out exactly who Elliot Marsh was, and exactly what he wanted from a woman who had spent the last 2 years of her life believing she had nothing left worth taking. That night, unable to sleep, Renee sat at her own kitchen table with her laptop open, searching for some way to make sense of what she had seen. She did not know the right words to type at first, and tried several before she found a phrase that returned pages of results instead of a handful. Financial exploitation of elderly parents by estranged relatives. What she read kept her at that table long past midnight. Article after article described the same pattern with a consistency that unsettled her more than any single detail could have on its own. It often began with charm, a sudden, attentive presence in an older person's life, someone who arrived with apologies for lost time, and a willingness to listen for hours to stories no one else seemed to have patience for anymore. It moved, slowly and carefully, toward isolation, gentle suggestions that old friends and other family members did not understand the relationship the way the newcomer did, that visits from outsiders were tiring, unnecessary, even a little disrespectful of the bond being rebuilt. And it nearly always arrived, eventually, at urgency, a deadline dressed up as practicality, a request for legal authority framed as nothing more than common-sense planning for an uncertain future. Renee read about adult children who reappeared after decades of silence, professionals who specialized in identifying lonely, asset-rich older adults, and building relationships with them under the guise of family or friendship, caseworkers describing victims who defended their abusers long after the evidence against them had become impossible to ignore, because admitting the truth meant admitting they had been deceived by someone they desperately wanted to trust. One article quoted a social worker describing the particular cruelty of cases built on real biological connection, where guilt over a long-ago choice made the victim far less likely to question the motives of the person exploiting it. She closed the laptop sometime after 1 a.m, her eyes burning, her stomach hollow, in a way that had nothing to do with hunger. Every pattern she had just read about matched what she had watched unfold in Carol's kitchen over the past 3 days, point for point, as though someone had written a manual, and Elliot had simply followed it with patience and care. The charm, the isolation, Grace told not to tire Carol out, the urgency, a deadline dressed in the language of kindness, the guilt, 50 years old and never once resolved, used now as the lever to move a frightened, lonely woman exactly where someone wanted her to go. Renee understood, lying awake long after she finally turned off the light, that she was no longer dealing with a strange family reunion gone slightly wrong. She was watching something with a shape and a name, something that happened often enough to have its own body of research, its own warning signs, its own quiet, well-worn path from a first-kind letter to a signature on a form that gave away everything a person had left. She did not yet know that the answer to that question had been sitting in Carol's own past for over 50 years, waiting in a box of old letters Carol had never once mentioned, not to Renee, and not, as it would turn out, to her own son. The attic stairs creaked under Renee's weight in a way that made her wince, though there was no one downstairs to hear her. Carol had asked for help finding a box of old photographs, something for a niece's wedding slideshow she had promised weeks ago and somehow forgotten until that morning, and Renee had volunteered before Carol finished the request, grateful for any reason to be alone with the contents of this house. The attic was smaller than she expected, low-ceilinged, lit by a single bare bulb that buzzed faintly when she pulled the chain. Boxes lined the walls in the careful labeled rows of a woman who had once been very organized about her own history. Christmas decorations, Jordan, elementary school, tax records, marked by year going back further than Renee thought the IRS even cared about anymore. She found the photo box Carol had asked for, easily enough, tucked near the stairs where it would be simple to reach. She could have stopped there. She told herself, later, that she had every intention of stopping there. But behind it, pushed further into the shadow of the eaves, sat a smaller box, unlabeled, the cardboard softened with age, in a way that suggested it had not been opened in a very long time. Renee knelt down and lifted the lid before she had fully decided to. Inside were letters, dozens of them, tied in small bundles with string gone brittle and yellow. Beneath the letters, a manila folder, official-looking, with a state seal printed faintly across the top corner. Renee opened it with the same careful, guilty hands she had used on the power of attorney form 2 days before, and read words that took a moment to fully land. A birth certificate, dated nearly 53 years earlier. A mother's name, Carol's maiden name, listed clearly in the space provided. A father's name left blank. And beneath it, a second document, a relinquishment of parental rights, signed in Carol's careful, looping handwriting, the same handwriting Renee had seen on 100 birthday cards and holiday notes over the years, except younger here, less practiced, the letters slightly larger, slightly less sure of themselves. A son. Carol had given birth to a son, decades before Jordan was born, and had signed him away before he was a month old. Renee sat back on her heels in the dim attic light, the folder open across her knees, and understood with a clarity that felt almost physical exactly who Elliot Marsh was, and exactly why Carol had grabbed her wrist hard enough to bruise, and whispered 5 words that made no sense until this very moment. Don't let him back in. Not a stranger. Not some opportunist who had wandered into an old woman's life looking for an easy target, though in some ways, Renee would come to understand, that description was not entirely wrong either. Elliot was the son Carol had given up over half a century ago, found now, somehow, and let back into a life that had spent 50 years carefully not mentioning he existed at all. Renee carried both boxes down from the attic, the photographs Carol had asked for, and the second box she had not, and found Carol in the kitchen, slicing an apple with the slow, deliberate care of someone whose hands had grown less steady than they used to be. Renee set the unlabeled box on the table between them, and said nothing at first, letting Carol see it, letting her decide on her own whether this was a conversation she was ready to have. Carol looked at the box for a long moment, the knife stilled in her hand. I wondered when someone would find that, she said finally, her voice quiet, stripped of the warm, vague pleasantness Renee had grown almost suspicious of over the last few days. This voice sounded like Carol's real voice, the one underneath, the one she had been performing. You had a son, Renee said gently, before Jordan. Carol nodded, slowly, and set the paring knife down beside the half-sliced apple. I was 17. My parents made the arrangements before I'd even finished crying about it. I never held him. They didn't let you, back then, if they thought you might change your mind. She looked down at her own hands, folded now in her lap, the same hands that had gripped Renee's wrist with such sudden, frightened strength 3 days earlier. I told myself for 50 years that he had a good life somewhere, a family who wanted him properly, the way I couldn't. Not at 17, not with my father the way he was. I told myself that was enough of a story to live with. And then he found you, Renee said. 8 months ago. Carol's eyes lifted, finally, and found Renee's. He wrote me a letter first. Very kind, very careful. He said he didn't want anything from me, just to know who I was, just to understand where he came from. A faint, bitter sound escaped her, not quite a laugh. I believed him. God help me. I believed every word of it, because I had spent 50 years wanting someone to say exactly those words to me, and here he was, saying them. Renee thought of the jacket on the hook, the tire tracks in the gravel, the unsigned form with Elliot's name printed in plain block letters, where a stranger's name should never have appeared. Carol, did you sign anything for him? Did you give him access to your accounts? Anything like that? Carol's gaze dropped again. He said it would be easier, if anything ever happened to me, if there was someone who could handle things quickly. He said Jordan was so far away so often, and it would be a burden on him, having to fly back every time there was a decision to make. He made it sound like a kindness, like something a good mother would do to spare her son the trouble. Her hands twisted together in her lap. I haven't signed it yet. I keep finding reasons to put it off. He gets short with me when I put it off. Not angry exactly, just short, disappointed, like I'm failing some kind of test. Renee reached across the table and covered Carol's hands with her own. You don't owe him anything, Carol. Not your signature, not your trust, not 50 years of guilt paid back all at once. I know that, Carol whispered. Some days I know that very clearly. And then he sits across from me in this kitchen and tells me how lonely he was, growing up, never knowing why his own mother gave him away, and I forget every word of it. I forget all of it, Renee. I just want to make it right for him, even though I know, somewhere underneath, that nothing I do now will ever actually make it right. It's already happened. It happened 50 years ago, and there's no version of this where I fix it by handing him my house. It was the most lucid Renee had heard her since this whole ordeal began, and somehow that lucidity frightened her more than any of the confusion had. Carol understood, on some level, exactly what was happening to her. She understood it, and could not seem to stop it from happening anyway. The guilt of 50 years acting like a hand pressed against her back, pushing her toward a decision she did not actually want to make. Renee tried calling Jordan twice that afternoon, and got his voicemail both times. A short text came through an hour later, sent from somewhere over the middle of the country judging by the timestamp and the apologetic shorthand. In the air, landing late. Call you tonight. Everything okay? Renee typed 3 different replies and deleted all of them before settling on a short, steady message that told him nothing close to the truth. Everything's fine. Talk tonight. She hated herself a little for sending it, but there was no version of the real story that fit inside a text message sent to a man strapped into an airplane seat with no way to do anything about what he was about to read. She left Carol's house an hour later, promising to come back the next day, and was halfway down the front walk when a gray sedan pulled into the driveway behind her own parked car, blocking her in without seeming to try. A man stepped out, broad-shouldered, dressed in a way that looked expensive without looking flashy, the kind of clothes chosen by someone who wanted to be underestimated and overestimated in equal measure, depending on the room he walked into. He smiled at Renee with an ease that did not quite reach his eyes, and she understood, before he said a single word, exactly who she was looking at. You must be Renee, Elliot said. My mother mentions you often. I'm glad she has friends checking in on her. Elliot, Renee said, and watched something flicker across his face at the sound of his own name in her mouth, something he smoothed over almost as quickly as it appeared. She told you about me then. His tone stayed pleasant, light, but his eyes had gone very still, the kind of stillness that did not match the rest of his relaxed posture at all. I imagine it must have been a strange thing to hear, a son nobody knew about, showing up after all these years. It was, Renee agreed carefully. I hope she also told you that I only want to take care of her. Elliot stepped a little closer, not close enough to be threatening in any way she could have described to someone else later, but close enough that Renee felt the difference in the space between them, the way a room feels different when someone stands at the edge of your personal space without quite crossing into it. She's not as steady as she used to be, you know, confused, some days. It would be a terrible thing if the wrong people took advantage of that. People with good intentions but no real understanding of what's best for her. I understand her better than you might think, Renee said. Elliot's smile thinned, just slightly, the warmth in it cooling by a few careful degrees. I'm sure you mean well, but this is a family matter now. I'd hate for things to get complicated for someone who's only trying to be a good friend. He let the sentence sit there for a moment, unfinished in a way that felt deliberate, and then his smile widened again, easy and warm, the version of his face he had clearly practiced in mirrors for exactly this kind of moment. It was lovely to meet you, Renee. I'm sure I'll see you again soon. He moved his car without another word, freeing her own from the driveway, and Renee drove home with her hands locked so tightly on the wheel that her knuckles had gone pale by the time she reached her own street. She had not imagined the threat underneath his pleasant words. She was certain of that now in a way she had not been certain of anything since this entire strange week began. Whatever Elliot wanted from Carol, he wanted it badly enough to warn off, in the politest possible language, a friend of the family who had only ever wanted to help. That night, when Jordan finally called, Renee told him everything. The whisper, the unsigned form, the box in the attic, and the brother he had never known existed. She told him about Elliot standing in his mother's driveway, smiling, warning her, in a voice soft enough to sound like concern, and sharp enough underneath to leave no doubt about what it actually was. There was a long silence on the line after she finished. I'm changing my flight, Jordan said finally, his voice rough in a way she had rarely heard it. Tonight, I don't care what it costs. Jordan, Renee, that's my mother. His voice cracked, just slightly, on the word mother, and steadied again just as fast. I'm coming home. Just, please, keep an eye on her until I land. Please don't let him take her anywhere. Renee promised him that she wouldn't. She did not yet know how close she would come to breaking that promise, or how little warning she would have before everything moved faster than either of them was ready for. The woman on the other end of the Adult Protective Services hotline had a kind voice and a patient, practiced way of explaining things that made Renee feel, within the first 2 minutes of the call, exactly how little power she actually had in this situation. Renee was not family. She had no legal standing, no documentation beyond an unsigned form she had read without permission, and a phone she had found and put back exactly where she found it. The woman took down everything Renee told her, every detail, the whisper, the unsigned power of attorney, the bank transfer notice, the neighbor's account of a man who came and went as he pleased. She promised someone would follow up. She could not say when. These things, she explained gently, took time, and without a family member formally requesting a welfare check or filing a report themselves, the wheels turned even more slowly than usual. Renee thanked her, hung up, and sat in her kitchen with her phone in her hand, feeling for the first time since this began that doing the right thing and doing the thing that would actually help Carol in time were not necessarily the same action at all. She called the bank next and got further, but not far enough. A fraud department representative confirmed, in the careful, hedged language of someone bound by privacy rules they could not bend even for a worried family friend, that they could neither confirm nor deny any activity on any account without the account holder's authorization or a formal complaint filed by the account holder herself. Renee asked, with as much calm as she could manage, what happened if the account holder was not in a position to file that complaint on her own behalf. The representative's voice softened slightly, an acknowledgement, if not quite an answer, and suggested Renee encourage Carol to call them directly, or have a family member with proper documentation reach out. Family member, Jordan, somewhere over the ocean or the plains or wherever his connecting flight had taken him by now, was the only family member who counted in any of these conversations, and Jordan was still a full day away from being able to do anything but worry from a window seat. Before driving back to Carroll Street, Renee stopped at the low hedge between the 2 yards, where Grace was once again working among her flower beds, this time with the wary, watchful look of a woman who had noticed far more in the last few days than she had let on the first time they spoke. "You look like someone who stopped believing this is nothing," Grace said, straightening up and pulling off her gloves. "I think it's worse than nothing," Renee admitted. "Grace, can you remember when he first started coming around? As close as you can recall?" Grace thought about it, counting backward in the careful way people do when trying to turn a vague feeling into an actual date. "Early spring, I'd say. Maybe a little before. I remember because the daffodils were already up, and I thought it was odd. A strange car parked in her drive, while the ground was still half frozen most mornings." She glanced toward Carol's house, lowering her voice slightly, though there was no one nearby to hear them. "It was once a week at first. Friendly enough, from what I could see. Then it became twice a week, then most days. And somewhere in there, Carol stopped coming by for coffee like she used to, stopped answering when I knocked. Some days, I told myself she was just busy, getting reacquainted with family, and it wasn't my business to make anything of it." "Did he ever say anything to you directly, besides asking you not to tire her out?" "Once," Grace said, and her mouth pressed into a thin line at the memory. "I asked him, plainly, who he was to her, since I'd never heard Carol mention a nephew or a cousin in 30 years of knowing her. He told me, very politely, that some family matters were complicated, and that Carol found it painful when people pried into things that weren't fully resolved yet. I felt foolish for asking after that. I didn't bring it up again." Grace shook her head slowly. "I should have brought it up again. I think some part of me knew that, even while I was deciding not to." Renee thanked her, and Grace caught her arm gently before she could turn away, the same kind of urgent grip Carol herself had used days earlier, though gentler, steadier, born of worry rather than fear. "Whatever you're about to do, be careful. A man who can talk a stranger out of asking a simple question that easily knows exactly what he's doing every time he opens his mouth." Renee carried that warning with her the rest of the drive, turning it over the way she had turned over every other small, unsettling piece of this last week, and decided she could not simply wait for the systems built to help people like Carol to catch up to a danger that was already, by every account she had gathered, well underway. She drove back to the house that afternoon with no clearer plan than checking on Carol one more time, making sure nothing had changed, buying whatever hours she could, until Jordan landed and the family member box on every form she had called that day could finally be checked. Carol answered the door looking pale, her eyes red-rimmed in a way that suggested she had been crying recently and had not quite finished. She let Renee in without much of her usual warmth, moving through the hallway with the stiff, careful steps of someone holding herself together by sheer effort. "He was here this morning," Carol said, before Renee had even asked. "He had the papers with him, the real ones this time, not drafts. He wants me to sign before the end of the week. He says it's only sensible, given how unpredictable my health has been lately." Her voice cracked on the word unpredictable, the same word, Renee realized, that Elliot himself had likely chosen for her, the kind of word that made a person doubt their own steady moments and trust only their confused ones. "Carol, you don't have to sign anything," Renee said, taking her hands. "Not today, not this week. Jordan is coming home. He'll be here tomorrow. He said if I don't sign by Friday, he'll have no choice but to assume I don't trust him, after everything he's tried to do for me." Carol's eyes filled again, fresh tears spilling over before she could stop them. "I don't want him to think that. I don't want him to leave again, Renee. Do you understand? I only just got him back. 50 years, and I only just got him back, and I'm so afraid that if I don't do this, he'll disappear again, and I'll have done it to myself a second time." Renee held both of Carol's hands and searched for words that could carry the weight of what she needed to say, without breaking the fragile, frightened woman in front of her into smaller pieces than she already was. "Carol, the man who loves you doesn't ask you to sign your whole life away by Friday, or threaten to disappear if you hesitate. That isn't love. That's a deadline. And good people don't put deadlines on someone they actually care about." Carol said nothing, but her grip on Renee's hands tightened, the same desperate strength Renee remembered from that first afternoon, the whisper afternoon, as if some part of Carol had been trying to say exactly this all along, and had only now found the words handed back to her by someone else. They sat together in the kitchen for nearly 2 hours, Renee talking softly, steadily, not pushing, just staying. The way you stay with someone standing too close to an edge, not grabbing them, just making sure they know they are not standing there alone. By the time the light outside had turned the deep gold of late afternoon, Carol seemed calmer, steadier. The tears dried and her hands finally loose and unclenched in her lap. Renee almost missed the sound of the front door. She heard it open before she heard footsteps, and by the time she turned toward the kitchen entrance, Elliot was already standing there, a leather folder tucked under one arm, his expression sliding from mild surprise into something colder the moment he registered exactly who he was looking at. "Renee," he said, and this time her name in his mouth sounded nothing like the warm, easy version he had used in the driveway days earlier. "I didn't realize you'd be here again. You really do check in often, don't you?" "Carol and I were just talking," Renee said, standing, putting herself, without quite deciding to, slightly between Elliot and the chair where Carol sat. "That's kind of you." Elliot's eyes moved to his mother, and something in his expression shifted again, softer now, performing concern the way he had performed it in the driveway, the way Renee imagined he had performed it for 8 months straight, every visit, every letter, every careful word designed to reach exactly the part of Carol that had spent 50 years aching to hear them. "Mom, you look tired. Have you been getting upset again?" "I'm fine," Carol said, but her voice had thinned, the steadiness Renee had worked 2 hours to build already, starting to fray at the edges of Elliot's presence in the room. "I think it might be best if Renee heads home," Elliot said, his tone gentle, reasonable, the tone of a man asking for nothing more than a little quiet for his exhausted mother. "We have some things to discuss, just the two of us, family things." Renee felt the pull of every instinct telling her to stay, to plant herself in that kitchen until Jordan's plane touched down, and felt, just as strongly, the certainty that staying any longer would only give Elliot a story to tell later, a story about an overbearing outsider inserting herself into a family's private business, a story that would make whatever came next that much harder for Jordan to untangle when he finally arrived. "I'll head out," Renee said carefully, meeting Carol's eyes for one long moment, trying to pour everything she could not say out loud into that single look. "Stay strong. Don't sign anything. Jordan is almost here. Carol, I'll call you tonight." Carol nodded, but her gaze had already begun drifting toward Elliot, toward the leather folder under his arm, the way a compass needle drifts back toward north no matter how far you turn it away. Renee walked out through the front door, down the path, past the gray sedan parked at an angle in the driveway, and did not let herself look back until she had reached her own car. When she did look, she saw, through the front window, two shapes moving in the kitchen. Elliot's broad shoulders bent over the table, the leather folder open now, papers spread across the surface where Carol's hands had so recently been wrapped around Renee's own. She sat in her car for a long moment, engine off, watching that window, hating every part of the decision she had just made to leave. Her phone buzzed. A text from Jordan, finally landed, racing through the airport, 3 hours from his mother's front door if traffic cooperated, longer if it did not. Renee typed back fast, telling him everything that had just happened, the papers, the deadline, Elliot's cold eyes when he realized she was there, and pressed send with hands that had not fully stopped shaking since she stepped out of that kitchen. She did not drive away. She told herself she was only waiting, only making sure nothing worse unfolded in the next few minutes. But as the light through Carol's kitchen window dimmed and the shapes inside kept moving, bent together over a table covered in paper, Renee understood that she was not simply waiting anymore. She was standing watch, the only one close enough to do it, over a woman who did not yet know how badly she needed someone standing guard. 40 minutes later, the front door opened again, and Renee's whole body went still in the driver's seat. Elliot came out first, moving fast now, none of the easy, practiced calm from earlier in his stride. He went straight to the gray sedan, popped the trunk, and went back inside. When he emerged again, he was carrying a suitcase Renee recognized, dark blue with a faded luggage tag, the one Carol kept on the top shelf of her closet for the rare trips she still took to visit her sister 2 states north. He was not taking papers to sign anymore. He was packing. Renee's hands found her phone before her mind had fully caught up to what she was seeing, and she dialed Jordan with fingers that barely managed to hit the right numbers, watching through the windshield as Elliot loaded the suitcase into the trunk and turned back toward the house with the quick, efficient movements of a man working against a clock only he could see. "He's packing a suitcase," Renee said the moment Jordan picked up, her voice low and fast. "Carol's suitcase. He just put it in his trunk." "I'm 20 minutes out, maybe less," Jordan said, and she could hear the highway noise behind him, the particular roar of someone driving faster than they should. "Renee, do not go back in there, please. Just watch the house. Call the police if he tries to leave with her. And tell them what? That a man is helping his mother pack a bag?" Renee's own voice sounded sharper than she meant it to, fear curdling fast into something closer to anger. "Jordan, there's no law against packing a suitcase." "Then stall him," Jordan said. "I don't care how. Just don't let that car leave the driveway before I get there." The call ended, and Renee sat for one more second with her hand on the door handle, weighing every version of what might happen next against every version of what she could live with if she did nothing at all. She got out of the car. She crossed the lawn at a pace just shy of running, reached the front door, and knocked instead of using the bell, some instinct telling her that a knock would draw less immediate attention than a chime echoing through the house. Elliot answered it himself, the leather folder gone now, his sleeves pushed up, his expression sliding instantly from startled to carefully blank the moment he saw who was standing on the porch. "Renee," he said, "I thought we'd said our goodbyes already today." "I left my scarf," Renee said, the lie arriving fully formed and faster than she expected, the kind of small, plausible fiction that came easier under pressure than she ever would have guessed. "Gray one. I think I left it on the back of a chair." Elliot studied her for a moment that stretched a beat too long to be comfortable, his eyes flicking past her toward the empty driveway, toward her car parked exactly where she had left it. "I don't have time for this right now. My mother and I have a trip to catch." "A trip?" Renee kept her voice light, curious, the voice of someone who had absolutely no idea what she had watched unfold through a kitchen window 40 minutes earlier. Carol didn't mention anything about a trip. "It came up suddenly," Elliot said, and something in the flatness of his tone told her he had stopped performing warmth entirely, had decided, somewhere in the last hour, that warmth was no longer worth the effort it cost him. "She needs a change of scenery, doctor's orders, more or less." "Which doctor?" Renee asked. "I can call and confirm if you'd like. I know her physician fairly well." The lie landed exactly where she wanted it to. Elliot's jaw tightened, Just barely, the first genuine crack Renee had seen in his composure since the driveway days earlier. Behind him, somewhere deeper in the house, Renee heard Carol's voice, faint, calling out a question she could not quite make out. "I really must ask you to leave," Elliot said, stepping slightly forward, not quite crossing the threshold, but closing the gap enough that Renee felt the full weight of his size for the first time. Broad enough to fill the doorway. Close enough that backing away suddenly felt like the only sensible thing left to do. "This is a family matter, and you are not family. I'd hate for this to become unpleasant." Renee held her ground for one more second, long enough to call past him, loud and clear. "Carol, it's Renee. I just wanted to say goodbye before your trip." It was not subtle. It was not clever. It was the only tool she had left. A name shouted into a house. A small flare sent up to let a frightened woman know that someone outside still knew exactly where she was. Elliot's expression hardened further, and for one long, suspended moment, Renee genuinely did not know what he was going to do next. Whether he would simply close the door in her face, or whether the careful, controlled version of himself he had shown the world for 8 months was about to slip entirely. Carol appeared behind him in the hallway, a coat already over her shoulders, her face pale and uncertain, in a way that made Renee's chest tighten painfully. "Renee?" Carol's voice wavered. "We're going on a trip. Elliot says it will be good for me." "Carol, you don't have to go anywhere today," Renee said, raising her voice just enough to be sure it carried past Elliot's shoulder. "Jordan's on his way. He'll be here any minute. Wouldn't you rather wait and see him first?" Something moved across Carol's face at the mention of her son's name, a flicker of clarity breaking through the fog Elliot had spent months carefully cultivating around her. "Jordan's coming?" "Mom, get in the car," Elliot said, his voice losing the last of its gentleness, sharp now, in a way Renee had not heard from him before. "We need to leave before traffic gets worse." "I think I'd like to wait," Carol said, and her voice, though small, held a thread of steel in it that had not been there a moment earlier. "I'd like to see Jordan." Elliot turned toward his mother, and for one unguarded second, Renee saw something in his face that erased every trace of the polished, reasonable man from the driveway, something tight and furious and frightened all at once, the expression of someone watching a plan months in the making come apart in real time. He caught himself almost instantly, smoothing it back into concern, but Renee had seen it, and she suspected, from the way Carol's eyes widened just slightly, that Carol had seen it too. In the distance, faint but growing, came the sound of an engine moving too fast for a quiet residential street, tires taking the corner at the end of the block hard enough to chirp against the asphalt. Jordan's car swung into view a moment later, and Renee had never in her life been so relieved to see a vehicle pull into a driveway it did not technically belong to. Jordan was out of the car before it had fully stopped rolling, leaving the driver's door hanging open behind him as he crossed the lawn in long, urgent strides. He looked exhausted, his clothes rumpled from a full day of travel, his eyes locking onto his mother standing in the doorway with a coat over her shoulders and a stranger's hand resting, lightly but unmistakably, against the small of her back. "Mom!" Jordan's voice cracked on the single word. Relief and fear tangled together so tightly that Renee could not have separated them if she tried. "Mom, are you okay?" "Jordan!" Carol's whole body seemed to soften at the sight of him, the careful, frightened stiffness she had been holding all afternoon finally breaking apart. She stepped forward, out from under Elliot's hand, and Renee watched the small, deliberate distance she put between herself and the man beside her, a distance that said more than any accusation could have. Elliot recovered his composure faster than Renee expected, stepping forward himself with his hand extended, his voice warm again, reasonable again, the practiced performance sliding back into place like a mask he had simply set down for a moment, and now picked back up. "You must be Jordan. I've heard so much about you. I'm Elliot. Your mother and I have a great deal to catch up on, as you might imagine." Jordan did not take the offered hand. He looked at Elliot for a long moment, something hardening behind his eyes as he took in the suitcase visible through the open trunk of the gray sedan, the leather folder still sitting on the porch railing where Elliot had set it down, the whole scene arranging itself into a shape Jordan was clearly only beginning to understand. "I know who you are," Jordan said quietly. "Renee told me everything on the drive over." Something flickered across Elliot's face again, the same crack Renee had glimpsed in the doorway minutes earlier, gone almost as fast as it appeared. "I'm not sure what you think you know, but I'd be happy to explain the situation, if you'll give me the chance." Your mother and I have been getting to know each other these past several months. I only want what's best for her." "What's best for her," Jordan repeated, his voice flat, "is a power of attorney form with your name on it that she hasn't signed yet, and a bank transfer she didn't authorize, and a suitcase packed for a trip nobody mentioned to me until 20 minutes ago. Does that sound right so far?" Elliot's jaw tightened, the warmth in his expression cooling by visible degrees. "You're listening to a woman who's known your mother for what, a decade? I'm her son. I have every right to be involved in decisions about her care." "You're a stranger she met 8 months ago," Jordan said, "who's been pressuring a 72-year-old woman into signing away control of her finances under a deadline, and who just tried to drive her out of state before her actual family could get here to ask any questions. I don't care what biology says. That's not a son taking care of his mother. That's something else entirely, and I think you know exactly what word belongs there." For a moment, nobody moved. Carol stood between the two men, her hands twisted together in front of her, her eyes moving from her newly arrived son to the man who had spent 8 months convincing her he was the missing piece of a 50-year-old wound. Renee stood a few steps back, close enough to intervene if she needed to, far enough to let Jordan have this moment without crowding it. "Carol," Elliot said, turning toward his mother, his voice shifting into something softer, more pleading, the same register he had likely used in dozens of quiet conversations over the past 8 months, to wear down her hesitation, one gentle word at a time. "You know I only ever wanted to know you, to be part of your life again. Don't let him turn this into something ugly." Carol looked at him for a long moment, and Renee watched something settle in her expression, the fog that had clouded her these past days finally, fully clearing. "I wanted to know you too," Carol said quietly. "I wanted that so badly I think I stopped asking myself why a man who only wanted to know his mother needed power over her bank accounts to do it." Her voice wavered but did not break. "I'm sorry for what happened to you, Elliot. I have carried that sorrow for 50 years, and I will carry it for whatever years I have left. But I won't sign that paper. Not today. Not on a deadline. Not because you're disappointed in me. I think it's time you left." The flicker of fury Renee had seen in Elliot's face in the doorway returned, and this time he did not bother smoothing it away. "You're going to listen to them over your own blood." "My own blood didn't try to put my suitcase in his trunk before I'd agreed to go anywhere," Carol said, and there was something in her voice now, thin but unmistakable, that sounded exactly like the woman who had once gripped Renee's wrist hard enough to leave a mark, the woman who had known, somewhere underneath all the fog and all the guilt, exactly what danger she was standing in. A patrol car turned onto the street then, moving without sirens but with a deliberate, unhurried purpose that drew every set of eyes on the lawn toward it. Renee had called the non-emergency line from her own car 20 minutes earlier, while Elliot and Jordan faced off in the doorway, describing as calmly as she could manage, an elderly woman possibly being moved against her will, and the dispatcher had promised someone would come look into it. The officer who stepped out, a steady, unhurried man who introduced himself as Officer Paul Yates, took in the scene on the lawn with the practiced, careful eyes of someone who had walked into 100 situations exactly this tense and learned, somewhere along the way, not to rush any of them. It took the better part of an hour to sort through. Officer Yates spoke to Carol alone first, away from both Jordan and Elliot, asking gentle questions about the suitcase, the trip, the papers on the kitchen table, listening with patient attention. As Carol's answers grew steadier the longer Elliot stood outside her sightline. He spoke to Renee, who handed over what she could, the unsigned form she had seen, the bank transfer notice, Grace's account from next door, careful to make clear what she had witnessed directly and what she had only heard secondhand. He spoke to Elliot last, and whatever was said in that conversation, conducted in low voices near the patrol car, ended with Elliot's easy composure gone entirely, replaced by something tight and cornered that no longer bothered pretending to be patient or kind. No one was placed in handcuffs that evening. Officer Yates explained, carefully and without much comfort in the explanation, that financial exploitation cases moved slowly, that proving intent took documentation and time, that what they had witnessed today, an unsigned form and a packed suitcase, was concerning enough to open a formal investigation, but not, on its own, enough to arrest a man for trying to take his mother on a trip. He took statements. He took photographs of the paperwork still spread across the kitchen table. He gave Jordan a case number and a list of next steps, an elder protection unit that would follow up within the week, a recommendation that Carol see her physician and consider, sooner rather than later, formally documenting her wishes about who could and could not make decisions on her behalf. Elliot left that evening with nothing signed, his composure cracked but his freedom intact, climbing into his gray sedan and pulling out of the driveway without a backward glance at the house or the family standing on its lawn. Renee watched him go and felt no relief in it, only the uneasy awareness that a man who had spent 8 months patient enough to wait for the right moment was unlikely to disappear simply because that moment had been taken from him today. The investigation, when it finally moved further than any of them expected. The bank's fraud department, once Jordan filed a formal complaint with his mother's documented consent, found 2 smaller transfers in the weeks before the one Renee had caught, both modest enough to avoid triggering automatic review, both authorized with a signature that Carol, once shown copies, did not recognize as her own. Officer Yates's report, combined with Grace's statement and the unsigned power of attorney form, was enough, eventually, for the Elder Protection Unit to recommend formal charges. Renee never learned every detail of what happened to Elliot after that, only that he did not come back to the house again. Not once, not even to collect the dark green jacket that hung, untouched, on the 3rd hook by the front door for nearly a month before Jordan finally took it down. After the patrol car pulled away and Carol had gone inside to lie down, Jordan found Renee still standing on the lawn, her arms wrapped around herself though the evening was not particularly cold. He stood beside her for a moment without speaking, watching the last of the daylight fade behind the houses across the street. "I don't know how to thank you for this," he said finally. "Any of it. The calls you made, the things you found, standing in that driveway today when you had no idea what he might do." His voice caught slightly. "You didn't have to do any of that. She's not your mother." "She's family enough," Renee said simply. "And besides, you'd have done the same for me. You did. Once. You just don't remember it, because it didn't look like this." Jordan managed a tired, surprised laugh when, "My grandmother, the year she started forgetting where she'd parked the car, and got it into her head that the mailman was stealing from her. You sat with her for an entire Sunday afternoon so I could go to that interview I was sure I'd fail. You didn't even know her that well yet." "I remember the mailman thing," Jordan said, shaking his head slowly. "I just didn't realize it counted as the same kind of thing as this." "It's all the same thing," Renee said. "Showing up when someone can't ask you to in a way that makes sense yet. That's the whole job, I think. Nobody hands you a clear reason. You just have to decide to take the small, strange things seriously before you understand it." They stood together a while longer, the porch light flickering on automatically as the dark settled fully over the street, and neither of them said much else, because there did not seem to be much else that needed saying. Some kinds of relief did not require more words than the silence of 2 tired people standing on a lawn, finally able to breathe. Grace came out onto her own porch a little later, drawn by the sound of the patrol car that had left 20 minutes earlier, and crossed the low hedge to join them, her face creased with the particular worry of someone who had spent the whole afternoon watching from her kitchen window and putting together pieces she could not quite finish on her own. "Is she all right?" Grace asked, looking toward the dark windows of Carol's house. "She will be," Jordan said. "Thanks to you and Renee both. I don't think I'd have known to ask the right questions if either of you hadn't already started asking them first." Grace's eyes glistened, and she waved a hand at the praise the way people do when they are not yet sure they have earned it. "I should have said something months ago, when that car first started showing up at strange hours. I told myself it wasn't my business." "You said something today," Renee told her gently. "That's what mattered. Carol needed someone paying attention today, not 6 months ago." Grace nodded slowly, accepting that the way a person accepts forgiveness they are not entirely convinced they deserve, and the 3 of them stood together a moment longer in the cooling evening air, an unlikely small alliance formed entirely out of one whispered warning, and the people who had decided, each in their own way, to take it seriously. Carol slept that first night with Jordan in the guest room down the hall, the way she had not needed since he was a teenager, afraid of nothing in particular and everything at once. In the morning, over coffee that had finally gone the right kind of warm, she told him the whole story, the 17-year-old girl, the parents who had made the decision for her, the 50 years of silence she had carried alone, because she had never found a way to begin a sentence that started with, "There was someone before you." Jordan listened without interrupting, his hand wrapped around hers on the kitchen table, and when she finished, he did not tell her it was all right, because it was not all right. Not entirely, not in a way either of them could fix with a single conversation. What he told her instead was that he was glad she had told him now, finally, after all these years, and that nothing she had just said changed one single thing about how much he loved her. Renee came by a week later, the kind of visit that no longer required worry, sitting in the front seat beside her the whole drive over. She found Carol in the garden, kneeling in the dirt with a fresh pair of shears, trimming the roses that had gone unattended for too long during the strangest week of her life. Carol looked up and smiled, a real smile this time, warm all the way through, nothing vague or distant behind it. "I keep thinking about that day," Carol said, sitting back on her heels. "The day you found me in the bedroom. I don't remember saying it, exactly, but Jordan tells me what I told you. Don't let him back in." "You don't remember?" Renee asked, sitting down on the garden bench beside her. "Bits and pieces," Carol said. "I think some part of me knew, even when the rest of me had talked myself into trusting him completely. I think that part of me was trying to leave a message for whoever showed up next, because I wasn't sure I'd be strong enough to say it myself when it mattered." She reached over and squeezed Renee's hand, the same hand she had gripped so tightly that first frightening afternoon, except gently now, gratefully now. "I'm glad it was you who showed up. I'm glad you listened." Renee thought about that afternoon often in the months that followed. The unlocked door, the cold teacup, the whisper that had not made any sense, until it made all the sense in the world. She thought about how close everything had come to unraveling quietly, without anyone outside that house ever knowing it was happening at all. How easily 5 whispered words might have gone unheeded if she had decided, in that first frightened moment, that Carol was simply confused, that there was nothing more to it than an old woman's tired mind playing tricks on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. She had not decided that. She had listened instead, and trusted the small, uneasy feeling in her chest, even when it had no proof yet to stand on. And that decision, more than any single document she found or any single conversation she had, was the thing that had made all the difference in the end. Some warnings arrive loud, impossible to ignore. Others arrive as a whisper, 5 words pressed urgently into someone's ear, in a quiet bedroom on an ordinary afternoon, easy to dismiss, easy to explain away as nothing at all. Renee had learned, in the hardest way possible, that the quiet ones were sometimes the truest of all, and that the only thing standing between a frightened person and the help they needed was someone willing to take a whisper seriously enough to follow it all the way to the end.